My name is Regina Birchall. My dad was Ed Birchall, who people know as HoHo the Clown. He was born in Colchester, Connecticut in 1923, and as a kid he always had an interest in circuses and clowns. He used to stage little events in his backyard and dress up the dogs and the cats and make them try to jump over the bucket and through the hoop. And he was an admirer of Emmett Kelly, and in fact modeled his makeup after Emmett Kelly. And as a young man, he was stationed at Will Rogers during the Second World War, where he met my mom, and they married in 1944. And after the war, he again was at Will Rogers, where he took advantage of the GI Bill and got his education in accounting from Oklahoma City University. And I believe one of his first jobs was an accountant job at what used to be Aero Commander, I think is now out at Wiley Post Airport. And during that time, he was interested in theater. I don't know that he was associated with any theater company in town, but I know that the family has pictures somewhere of him playing the Teddy Roosevelt character in Arsenic and Old Lace. And his interest continued to grow. He met a man named Fritz Holzberlein, who actually helped him get started in clowning. And an interesting note is that Fritz was he was somehow connected with the statue of the cowboy and the horse that I think is somewhere downtown, the cowboy staking his claim. And as a bluebird in first grade, my mother took the bluebird group down to Fritz's property that used to be down on 10th Street, I think, and we saw the models for that statue. So there's probably a little more detail that somebody in the family has, but I know his dad's relationship with Fritz Holzberlein was instrumental in getting him started in clowning. And so as the family grew, eventually there were 6 of us. My dad kept his accounting job and did birthday parties on the side. Or he would open grocery stores or work for any sort of social function that needed some special activity. He would do singular events like that. And over the course of time, he of course became more interested, and I think clowning was more satisfying for him than accounting. And eventually, I guess around 1958 or 59, he quit his job at Aero Commander and struck out full time as an entertainer. And I think at that time there was a children's show personality on KOCO called Captain Art. And as I understand it, Captain Art wasn't particularly fond of children, but he had the kids show in the afternoons. And in my memory, Captain Art went on vacation, and my dad talked to the powers that be out there and subbed for Captain Art during that time. And over the course of those 2 weeks, I think they were very impressed with my dad and eventually offered him that job. Now, I don't know any details about whether how Captain Art felt about that. But that's what I remember is how my dad started on television. So, and I was probably 5 or 6 or 7 maybe. And he had an afternoon show. Well, he had a series of shows. Kitty Clover, Potato Chips, Felix the Cat, HoHo's Cartoon Circus. And it was similar to the Foreman Scotty show, where there'd be a group of children and they would have some, Kitty Clover's Junior Auction. I recall that one. I know that during those days, on an occasion, the children who were scheduled to be on the show did not arrive. And at the last minute, my dad would call home and my mom would do a roundup of the neighborhood, and we'd all jump in the station wagon and head out to the station. So we were sort of the clackers that would fill in on the days that my dad needed us. So that was one benefit of a large family. And we had a good time out there. So his work out there went through several permutations of time and activities. But the big show that most people remember was Lunch with HoHo. And I think that was, to my recollection, around the mid-60s. Clear up through, at least through 1970, I think. My dates probably are a little fuzzy. But that was an hour-long show that he was really able to spread out and do a lot of different activities. And he always had a science project. And I remember as a kid that he would often spend Sunday afternoons practicing the trick. And quite often it worked. And I would lean up on the table on my elbows watching how he was working the experiment. And then quite often it didn't work on television, so he was always puzzled. That worked yesterday when the kids and I were doing it at home, so that was always a big chuckle. And he had quite an imaginative crew out there that allowed him a lot of flexibility to try different ways of presenting material. The Tempest Levitator was a fun vehicle before Star Trek and Star Wars and all that stuff. This was the vehicle that could take you to the future, take you to lots of interesting places around the world. I think it's probably an indicator of the internet to come. He was far ahead of his time. So, and the Tempest Levitator would take you to Hawaii or England or Canada, where there was some interesting bit of footage that he thought was educational. Of course, there was Jeannie, and most of the time people ask me about if she died on television, and that did not happen. That is a rumor that has been around for many years, but she was a dog that he picked up in Amarillo. In 1960, we had just moved into a very big house where there was room enough for all of us and an acre of land, and we'd moved, changed schools, and it was a big summer for our family. And he accepted a job in Amarillo, Texas. At the time, he thought it would be much the same as what he was doing at KOCO. And just lately, I have learned that a little bit of that backstory, that Ben West, who was the general manager out there, really took a chance on Dad and had given him that job originally. And soon after that job, he accepted the job, this other job in Amarillo came open. And my dad quit KOCO. And off to Amarillo he went, thinking it was a better deal. And come to find out after he got out there that the powers that be wanted him to do the kids show, but then also clean the sound stage and take care of the bathrooms and do janitorial services. And that was not clear when my dad accepted the position. And he stayed out there about 6 months and came back, I think, with his hat in his hand. And as I understand it, they really didn't have much reason to take him back, but they did. And thank you, Ben West, for that, wherever you are. Because by all rights, he probably shouldn't have gotten his job back, but he did. And as they say, the rest is history. He went on to develop quite a program at Channel 5. But he had a good group of people around him. He had, of course, Bill Howard and Mike Waters. That they were quite a trio. And my dad always gave Bill credit. And in fact, one time we were somewhere at home. I think we were probably at dinner. And he often told stories about the antics that Bill had done that day. And he looked at me and he said, "The puppet makes your old man look good." And I remember telling that to a group of people from Channel 5 one time, and they all, I think, were a little upset at that. But my dad gave Bill a great deal of credit for the success of that show. And I think they were brothers in the true ways of the heart. They had such an interesting and strong connection. And I think they loved each other dearly. And my dad always appreciated and always enjoyed Bill so much. So I always thought that was a telling remark about Dad. I think Dad was probably the heart of the show, but Bill was certainly the soul. And I think Dad would have probably agreed with that. And then Mr. Misto, Mike Waters, they couldn't have done it without him. And I think they were a trio of really connected fellows. And they did good work. And they were funny and they were witty. And a lot of the work they did was directed as much to adults as it was to children. And they had a kind-hearted approach, and they were funny, and I think that show was really interesting because it never talked down to kids. It was about kids, it was for kids, but it never talked down to children. And I have always appreciated those stories that people have told me through the years about how they felt that Dad was like a real friend to them. And I think it shows when you look at videos and tapes and things like that. So the show moved along into the 70s, and then of course things change, and what I understand is that somebody wanted to put OU football on TV, and they had to do some changing in the schedules between the local and the national scheduling, and something had to give, and it was the hour of time that was my dad's show. So after that, the show went through more changes to be half-hour shows, and sometimes he was on for 15 minutes, 5 days a week, or finally I think the show ended up on Saturday mornings. So he really lasted, I think, 29 years on KOCO in several different versions of Pokey and HoHo. But it was always with an idea that there was something to learn and something interesting just around the corner, and you found ways to learn those things. He had connections with people from the zoo who would bring animals out. There was often a lot of silliness going on, but always of a kind-hearted nature, and there was a very sweet spirit about that show. Well, there is a tale from very early on. My younger sister had a confrontation with my dad one morning, I think before school, and she got in trouble for something, and Dad sent her upstairs or some sort of consequence, and as she was stomping up the stairs, she turned around and said, well, from now on I'm going to watch Captain Kangaroo. So I remember my mom laughing from the other room on that one, and my dad got a good laugh out of that as well. And it's an odd situation to be a child of a celebrity like this, because from the inside out, he's just your dad, and he had an unusual job, and it was hard to understand what the big deal was about him in many ways. I mean, it was just an unusual thing, of course, that your dad would come home at night with makeup on, and but he was still your dad, and we didn't have that perspective that others do, of course. And it wasn't until much later of how much we appreciated the impact and influence that he had with his job. One of the things that in the heyday of the Lunch with HoHo, there was I think we were talking that there was more interest not more interest, but a large following of students, college students. Of course, they had the time and they had the ability to watch TV at noontime, which you didn't if you were in grade school or junior high. But there was a big following, and in fact, at one time there was a group of people that called themselves the Royal Order of the Argyle Sock, and they were big fans of Pokey. There have been lots of stories about how Pokey, the actual puppet, was created, and in my recollection, my dad would come home and he would ask my mother, he said, Pokey's getting a little worn, and can you help us with that? So she would go to the random sock box, which in a large family there was always a mismatched sock or a singular sock, and she'd pull one out and she would make the puppet. So and she would make the skirt or the dress around his the longer portion of his arm from a scrap piece of fabric that she had. And I remember about 4 different Pokies. Now, there are people who have told me that their mother made Pokey, and I know that a lot of people have a different memory of things than we do. So perhaps that's true that somebody helped out and donated a Pokey, but in my memory, my mom was the one who built the puppet. One of the most interesting stories in that regard is when she had chosen I think it was a dark purple sock, and it was only on TV a couple of days, and there was a little dust up with the NAACP that some sort of discrimination thing. Now, this was back in the 60s when a lot of that stuff was really intense. But on black and white television, it showed up as a black puppet. And my dad came home and said, well, we really can't use that one. And in fact, I didn't know this till much later, that my dad was a card-carrying NAACP member for several decades, back before that was at the time that was an unusual thing. But he was very much in support of equal rights long before it was popular or the smart thing or whatever. My dad was absolutely fascinated with the circus, and the circus would come to town. Well, it didn't matter. Any kind of circus came to town, and we wouldn't see him. He would go down to the train yards and watch the trains bring the circus in. And he would watch them take the elephants off, all the animals, but he was mostly fascinated with the elephants. And he would come home late at night, and he would be gone in the morning before we were up. And for the whole time the circus was in town, we never saw him. And he was befriended by the clown alley in the circus, and every time they came to town, he spent all his time with them, and he would do the walk-arounds with them, and he just immersed himself in all of the sawdust and the smells and the sights and the sounds of the circus. He absolutely loved it. And there was one time when he had gone to visit my sister in Austin, and the circus came to Austin. So off they went to the circus in Austin, and he walked into the clown alley, and they were all so surprised to see him and glad he was there, but had no idea he was going to be in Austin as well. But one of the funny stories, when the Clyde Beatty Cole Brothers Circus came, and it seems like it was it was somewhere within town, but this would have been back in the 60s, and so it was a big vacant area. And my dad got out of the car and he took a great big sniff, and he said, "Oh, isn't that a grand smell of the circus?" And my brother looked at him and said, "No, Dad, that's not the circus, that's elephant poop." And my dad didn't care. It had to do with the circus, and he thought it was wonderful. So he absolutely delighted in anything that had to do with the circus, whether it was a very small one or the large ones. And when he passed, the clowns from the Ringling Brothers Circus were very kind and very, very sweet to my mom. And that year when they came through town, we were special guests of the circus, and they made a lovely tribute to him. And that was always very, very special in his heart, to be associated with the Ringling Brothers Circus. And that goes all the way back to when he was a little boy, and held circuses in the backyard. His mother used to say she couldn't get him to come in because he was trying to figure out another trick and try to get the dog to do something he wanted him to do. So that was very much in his bones. And good memories of going to the circus. Of course, we didn't love it like he did, and sometimes we didn't understand why it was so important to him, but we certainly knew it was, and anytime the circus was in town, we knew where we could find Dad. One of the things he did regularly throughout his career was to participate in the cerebral palsy telethons that were broadcast every year down at the Civic Center Music Hall. And that was also a period where he was committed through the whole process. And I think it was usually a 3-day period where they were on TV 24 hours, or they stayed on the air past regular broadcast hours. And he was strongly committed to activities that promoted wellness and health with children, and particularly those who had difficulties and disabilities of some sort. And he was one. I remember Ida B. spent a lot of time down there. Count Gregor was there. Foreman Scotty and 3D Danny. They were all part of those activities. And also the Goodwill tours. My dad was, it was like a 3 or 4 day jaunt where civic leaders traveled around the state in buses and would stop in towns and promote civic events. And of course he was always among them, building balloon animals and doing card tricks, and he could make rabbits and mice out of handkerchiefs. That was quite a process. I remember as a child, often we would go to birthday parties with him, and I would sit close by and just observe him take that handkerchief and create the mouse, and that was one of the big tricks in his bag. And over the course of time, I watched it enough times that I finally figured out how to do it. And I remember the time it was pretty raggedy, but my first effort at it, I showed to him, and I think it impressed him that I had been paying attention. So even today, I think I can still make that rabbit out of a handkerchief. So, and he had a box of, funny magic tricks and quarters behind the ears and card tricks and magic wands and all that kind of stuff. So a standard satchel of what were magical and mystical tricks at the time, but it was always done in good humor, and it was never, his humor was never at anyone's expense. It was always very lighthearted and very generous in nature. So those Goodwill tours were a time where he could practice that sort of thing. Often he would take out-of-town engagements, and I remember this one experience where my mom, our dog, and I went with Dad to Mountain View, and he did a fundraiser or I was like 6 or 7, so I was just in the car riding, but we had car trouble on the way back from Mountain View outside of Cordell, and it was cold. It was very, very cold, and my dad's out by the side of the highway there were no lights for anywhere, and he's in his clown makeup, flags down a guy in a truck, and my mom and I pile in the truck with him, and we had to leave the dog in the car, and that was very concerning to me. But we went into Cordell, and my dad's in his makeup, and we go to the hotel, and he rings the bell, and no one comes out, and he rings it, and he rings it, and he rings it. And finally, he goes around the counter and knocks on the door that has one of those reverse mirror pieces of glass in it. Come to find out that a gal named Millie, who owned the hotel, was on the other side of the door and had responded at the first time my dad rang the bell, only to see this guy in this makeup, and he didn't have his nose on, and he was disheveled, and it's about 1 a.m, and there had been some trouble in Cordell with somebody escaping or somebody doing harm to someone, and she had decided that my dad, this was the guy, and she had a gun, and she had decided that if he opened the door, that was the line. And my dad tried the door, and it was locked. so he didn't go any further, and he walked back away. And I don't know what the reason was. Oh, she called the sheriff, and he came down to see what was going on. And it wasn't until the sheriff assured her that my dad was just a clown without his nose on in car trouble that we were able to get a room and spend the night, and then got back on the road the next day. So that little tale could have made things go a lot different for my family. So it's always interesting in retrospect to look at how my dad's career influenced Oklahoma City and the impact he had on pretty much a generation of people. My family often has talked about the fact that we think there's probably a picture of my dad in every household photograph book somewhere, that a child had a birthday party or there was an event where they met my dad or he was at their house, and that's really quite a special thing. Growing up, we just saw him as our dad with an unusual job, and didn't realize the influence he had on our city until he passed, and the outpouring of affection and concern for our family was very touching. And even through the years, when people are introduced to us and told that he was our dad, there is such a feeling of kindness and generosity that it's like the feelings from our dad is passed on to us. And that's a very, very special tribute to his memory and the feelings and the affection that people had for him. He was very conscious of his place in the community and the role that he had to teach good and kindness. I think he had that was part of his energy as a human being, to make life better when he left than when he saw it, when he arrived. And I think he did. I think he made. I think he really brought a lot of heart to a time in our city's history that's very, very special. And that feeling for him has carried on, and it's really nice that I've never heard a criticism about my dad. Oftentimes when personalities or people in public arenas look back, or people look back at their careers, there's always some sort of asterisk or yes but, or but there's never a time that people don't have a word of kindness and respect for my dad. And I think that's very special.